My queen, have mercy on me! Guards, seize this man and execute him!
As evening approached, the palace began preparing once again for Queen Esther's banquet. Servants moved carefully through the royal halls, lighting golden lamps along the walls. Their soft glow reflected against the polished marble floors, filling the room with warm light. Beautiful Persian carpets were laid across the floor. Silver dishes were arranged on the banquet table. Bowls of fruit, sweet wine, and fragrant foods were placed carefully in perfect order. Everything had to be flawless, but tonight's banquet was not simply a royal gathering. Something important was about to happen. Queen Esther stood quietly for a moment before entering the hall. Her face appeared calm and graceful, as a queen's should be. But inside, her heart was steady with purpose. She remembered the 3 days of fasting. She remembered the prayers whispered in silence. And she remembered the reason she had risked everything. Across the empire, her people were still under a deadly decree. Tonight, she would speak the truth. Soon, the doors opened. King Xerxes entered the hall first, surrounded by attendants. He looked curious, even slightly amused by the mystery of Esther's request. After all, she had invited him twice but still had not revealed what she wanted. Moments later, Haman entered the banquet room. He walked with confidence, though the events of earlier that day still lingered in his mind. The memory of leading Mordecai through the city streets was not easy to forget, but he forced himself to focus on the honor before him. After all, he was the only official invited to dine privately with the king and queen. Surely that meant he was still greatly favored. Queen Esther greeted them both with quiet grace. The banquet began. But beneath the peaceful setting, destiny was quietly unfolding. The banquet table was filled with rich foods and sweet aromas. Golden cups were filled with wine. Servants moved silently around the room, attending to every need. For a time, the conversation was light. The king spoke about matters of the empire. Haman laughed politely at the king's remarks. Esther listened quietly, waiting for the right moment. She had carefully planned this evening. She knew that timing mattered. Finally, after the wine had been served, the king turned his attention fully toward Esther. His voice was warm but curious. "Queen Esther," he said gently, "what is your petition?" The room grew quiet again. He continued with the same generous promise he had made before. "It shall be granted to you." Then he added once more, "Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you." The words carried great authority. Such an offer showed how deeply the king favored his queen. But Esther was not seeking riches. She was not asking for land. She was not asking for power. What she needed was far more serious. For a brief moment, she lowered her eyes. Then she lifted her gaze again. This was the moment she had prepared for. Esther spoke carefully. "If I have found favor with the king," she began softly, "and if it pleases the king." Her voice was gentle, but every word carried weight. "My petition and my request is this." She paused. The silence in the room grew deeper. "Spare my life." The words surprised the king immediately. His eyebrows lifted in confusion. Spare her life? What danger could possibly threaten the queen? Esther continued, her voice steady despite the seriousness of what she was revealing. "And spare the lives of my people." The king leaned forward, listening closely. "For we have been sold," she said, "to be destroyed, killed, and completely wiped out." The room seemed to grow colder. These were not ordinary words. They spoke of betrayal. They spoke of danger within the empire itself. Esther continued gently, "If we had only been sold as slaves, I would have remained silent. But this evil threatens lives, and it cannot be ignored." The king's expression changed from confusion to rising anger. Someone had dared to threaten the queen? and an entire people. The question burst from him. Who is he? The king demanded suddenly. Where is the man who dared to do such a thing? The question echoed sharply across the banquet hall. All eyes turned toward Esther. This was the moment the truth could no longer remain hidden. Esther slowly lifted her gaze. She did not rush. She did not tremble. With calm courage, she turned her eyes across the table, toward Haman, the powerful official who sat proudly beside the king. Her voice remained steady. The adversary and enemy, she said clearly, is this wicked Haman. The words fell like thunder in the quiet room. Haman's face instantly turned pale. For a moment, he could not breathe. The king stared at him in disbelief. Shock filled the room. The man he had trusted, the man he had promoted above the other officials, was responsible for the decree that threatened the queen herself. Anger rose quickly within the king. Without saying another word, he stood suddenly from the table. The tension in the room was too great. He walked out into the palace garden, needing a moment to think. But inside the banquet hall, Haman remained behind, and fear had already begun to consume him. The moment the king left the room, Haman's confidence vanished. All the pride he once carried disappeared in an instant. He now understood the danger he was in. The decree he had written had unknowingly threatened the queen herself, and the king's anger had been unmistakable. Haman turned quickly toward Esther. Panic filled his face. He rushed toward her, his voice trembling with fear. "Please, my queen," he begged desperately. "Spare my life." He fell beside the couch where Esther reclined. The powerful official who once demanded that others bow before him was now the one pleading. Gone were the proud speeches. Gone was the arrogance. Now there was only desperation. His voice shook as he continued begging for mercy. Esther remained quiet. She did not move. She did not answer. The same man who had planned the destruction of her people was now asking for compassion. Outside the hall, the king walked through the palace garden, his anger still burning. Inside the banquet room, Haman continued to plead desperately. But the moment for mercy was slipping away, and justice was drawing near. While Haman pleaded desperately for mercy, the king was walking through the palace garden. The cool evening air did little to calm his thoughts. What he had just heard troubled him deeply. A decree had been issued across the entire empire, a decree that threatened the life of the queen herself, and the man responsible had been sitting beside him at the banquet table. The king walked slowly among the palace trees, his mind racing. How had this happened? How had such a terrible plan been approved without him realizing the truth? After a moment, he turned and walked back toward the banquet hall. Inside, the room had grown tense. Haman was still begging Esther for mercy. He had fallen beside the couch where she reclined, reaching toward her in desperation. Just then, the king stepped through the doorway, and what he saw made his anger burn even hotter. The king stopped suddenly at the entrance of the room. His eyes widened in shock. Haman was leaning over the queen's couch, pleading for his life. To the king, it looked as if Haman had gone too far. "Will he even attack the queen in my own palace?" the king shouted in outrage. The room instantly erupted with movement. The royal guard stepped forward at once. In the Persian court, when a person was condemned, their face was often covered as a sign that judgment had been passed. Without hesitation, the guards covered Haman's face. The once powerful official could no longer see the room around him. His fate had already begun to unfold. The king's patience was gone. Betrayal, anger, and justice had collided in one moment, and the king was ready to act. As the guards held Haman, one of the king's attendants stepped forward. He spoke carefully, knowing the seriousness of the moment. "There is something the king should know," the servant said. The king turned toward him. "What is it?" The servant continued, Haman has built a gallows at his house, very tall. The king frowned. For whom? For Mordecai, the servant answered, the man who once saved the king's life. For a brief moment, the king was silent. The realization deepened his anger. Mordecai, the man who had once uncovered a plot to assassinate the king. The man whose loyalty had protected the throne. And Haman had built a gallows for him? The injustice was clear. And the king's decision came swiftly. Hang him on it, the king ordered firmly. The words echoed across the banquet hall. The same gallows Haman had proudly built to destroy Mordecai would now become the place of his own judgment. The guards immediately led him away. The once powerful noble who had walked proudly through the palace halls was now carried out in disgrace. His pride had lifted him high above others, but his wicked plan had brought about his own downfall. Before the day ended, Haman was executed on the very gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. Justice had been served, but the danger facing Esther's people was not yet over. The palace slowly returned to calm after the storm. The king turned to Queen Esther with compassion and gratitude. Soon afterward, he gave Haman's entire estate to her. But Esther had one more important truth to reveal. She told the king about Mordecai, the faithful man who had raised her as his own daughter, the same man who had once saved the king's life. The king listened carefully. Then he removed his royal signet ring, the symbol of authority he had once given to Haman, and he placed it into Mordecai's hand. In that moment, power shifted. Mordecai was placed in charge of Haman's estate, and Esther appointed him to oversee it. But although Haman was gone, one problem still remained. The decree against the Jewish people was still written into law. Across the vast Persian Empire, the order for their destruction still stood. Esther and Mordecai had won an important victory, but the final battle to save their people had only just begun. And the next step would require even greater courage.